Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
48 hours away. Do you know where your NBA GM is going to be once free agency negotiations open up on Friday evening? My suspicion is that for the Rockets, Rafael Stone may end up being in Los Angeles because that's where, according to reports, Fred VanVleet of the Toronto Raptors is going to be once the window officially opens on Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. Houston time, 3 p.m. Pacific, for free agency agreements to officially be reached. So to talk about what the implications are here in Houston and, quite frankly, well beyond, because with the Rockets having a league-leading salary cap figure of nearly $60 million in space beneath the cap, along with the potential to use the room exception of nearly $8 million a year, the reality is that what the Rockets do could set the market for the NBA as a whole. So what happens here in Houston impacts everywhere else. And conversely, there's a lot of situations elsewhere that may impact what Rafael Stone does with all of that money here in Houston. So to preview what's ultimately a very important weekend for the franchise, we expect it to move quickly. I'm joined today on the Logger Line by my good friend, co-host and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. This is the show, the Logger Line, that is, where we cover everything Houston Rockets basketball, for better or for worse. We had our draft reaction show last weekend to the Rockets, bringing in Cam Whitmore and Amin Thompson, two guys that could be building blocks of the future. Now, this coming weekend, the Rockets are going to be bringing in guys that could be more present pieces, guys that can help them next season specifically. We know the Rockets are looking into short-term, bigger money deals because the hope is that by 2 or 3 years from now, a lot of these young guys are ready to step into even bigger roles. What they're looking for now is players who can bridge the gap to take them from 22 and 60 to something more relevant, put the players, the young prospects that is, into a more competitive environment day in, day out. And so hopefully the Rockets will be signing some players in the near future that help them with that objective. Anyway, we're going to be discussing all of that today on the Logger Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben DuBose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Joined by my good friend, Paulo Alves. You can follow him on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. And I'll be honest, there's a lot of Rockets fans that aren't necessarily looking forward to the opening of free agency because there's some sticker shock with these figures. There's talk that the Rockets might end up offering a max to VanVleet at over $40 million a year on average in order to get him to take a 2-year deal. Now, that's not as big of a deal to the Rockets because they have an artificially low payroll as it is. Somebody's going to get that money. So many of the players on this team are very young and not guys that are being paid what their contributions really are until their second contract. So in the short term, you can certainly give out bloated deals without it having much of a consequence, but nobody enjoys seeing the figures that are thrown out for non-superstars. And so I think while there's excitement for free agency, there's also a little bit of sort of nerves and let's just get this over with component to it as well. Paulo, where are you at entering Friday night?
Yeah, I'm definitely nervous because it's not so with the draft, right? It's basically all upside. You may make a bad decision, but it's all like the ripple effects. It's not going to negatively impact your team going forward, because it's always better to have a draft pick than to not have it at all. With free agency, it's different because every team has the cap space, and so your decisions may actually hurt going forward rather than help. And so the spectrum of outcomes is a little bit bigger. So I'm definitely nervous because we've seen it before. Ryan Anderson being an example that contracts can, or long-term contracts can hurt your flexibility going forward. The other angle that has me worried is the fact that Rockets are a very young team, and the vets that you're going to bring in have to really be worth it because they're going to be taking minutes away from guys that are a part of the future and that you're going to develop. And so, just reacting a little bit to the latest reports, I've made my peace with Dylan Brooks, right? He's probably going to come. Hopefully, he's not coming on a long-term deal. Hopefully, it's just 1 or 2 years, and you retain the early bird rights if you want to bring him back. If it works out, you can always extend him. I've already made my peace with that one. It's not ideal. I would love for a different team to offer, or a contending team to offer them their full non-taxpayer MLE. It's likely not going to happen. He's likely coming here. Is what it is. I've settled on that one. Fred VanVleet's a little bit different, right? Because I actually like him better than Dylan Brooks, and I think he fits a role that's needed for us going forward, at least the next 2 years. And so, while it's not ideal that you're spending 40 million of your current cap space on him, it's also not the end of the world, because you got to spend it on someone, and he is, outside of James Harden, the best point guard available that you can get through free agency, right? You could always trade for one, could always take a salary dump like Kyle Lowry, but he is the best available. I don't think he's great. I've talked about my issues with the fact that he's undersized and aging. I've talked about the fact that his efficiency is very poor, has been throughout his entire career, and was especially so last year. But hey, hopefully we're in a team with more offensive weapons and hopefully better spacing in Houston, and more guys that can put the ball on the floor and create for themselves. Hopefully that makes it easier on him. So it's not ideal, but I'm fine with it. I would rather use that cap space to go after a guy like Cam Johnson, for example, but they're likely going to have competition for him with the Pistons, who have Monty Williams, who used to coach Cam Johnson in his first 3 years in the league when he was in Phoenix. So there might be a connection there. Other than that, Cam has already made it very clear that he really likes Brooklyn and wouldn't mind coming back. So it might be, that the front office has explored that avenue and they've deemed it to be a long shot, and so it's not worth it, and that's why they're settling into Fred VanVleet. But ultimately, long term, as long as it's not more than 2 years, for the fact that Amen Thompson may be good enough in 2 years, and so you need a contract that you're able to either move or just let expire, it's fine, right? It doesn't get me excited, but it's fine. The one that does get me excited is the Brook Lopez rumor, which has been shut down by Mark Stein, but at the same time, Kelly Iko of The Athletic, the Houston Rockets beat reporter, called it, in his opinion, and it's not a report, right? It's his opinion, called it a 50-50. And to me, that's the big prize. To me, he is the best vet in free agency. He provides everything that Houston wants. Someone that's not, that's probably going to be okay not playing 30 minutes a night, and that you can play both him and Sengun heavy minutes. You could even try them together. Someone that brings a different skill set to what the Rockets currently have. Someone that fits perfectly with Amen Thompson and what he needs early on, and someone who is a really unique archetype, and that's why, to me, he is the most important guy, because there's not really a clear replacement through free agency or through trades unless you're giving up significant assets. It's really rare to find a guy that's an elite rim protector and that can space the floor like Brook Lopez. The fact that he's a vet, that he's already won a championship, that he has all of that experience is also a plus for him. So I'm going into it kind of praying that at least Brook Lopez we can get. And if we get Brook Lopez, I'll already be happy. I think they already knocked it out of the park with the coaching hire. I think the draft was also a home run. And so out of free agency, I don't expect much. Not that I don't expect much, but you don't need to do much to have a successful offseason, considering you already nailed the two biggest parts. And so heading into it, I'm okay with Fred VanVleet. I'm okay with Dylan Brooks, even though it's not my favorite idea. What I really, really want out of it is that they make the extra effort, or whatever effort that they can, to go get Brook Lopez. And this will sound dumb, and it will sound like a hot take, because it's not what the market is dictating. But I would rather pay, if it ensures that he's coming, I would rather give the contract you're giving to Fred VanVleet to Brook Lopez and go for a cheaper point guard than go for Fred VanVleet and not get Brook Lopez, because when you look at the replacements for them, if you don't get one of them, it's a lot harder to replace what Brook Lopez would bring than what it would be for Fred VanVleet sorry. It's a lot harder to replace what Brook Lopez can be than it is to replace what Fred VanVleet can bring. You could go off and try and get Monte Morris. You could go and try and get Kyle Lowry. You could even try and, there's Dennis Schroeder is a free agent, for example. D'Angelo Russell is a free agent. You can get worse versions of Fred VanVleet if you need to. And so we're in this weird situation where, yes, we have 60 million in cap space, but you can spend a lot of it and you can overpay for guys because you're looking at a 2-year window in any of these contracts where most of your rookie guys don't have to get paid yet. And so this cap space, you can't approach it the same way you would for a team that's already contending and looking at the long term because of exactly that. And so it's kind of a zero-sum game between the guys that you're trying to bring in. And in a zero-sum game, knowing that the money has to be spent and that it's not going to be spent past 2 years, knowing that those are the rules of the zero-sum game, I value Brook Lopez versus the field of centers available a lot higher than I value Fred VanVleet versus the field of point guard options that are available. So that's kind of my mindset going into it. I'm really looking forward to seeing what ends up becoming what, because we hear a lot of rumors, and today was mostly negative on Brook Lopez and mostly reassuring on Fred VanVleet as far as the Rockets' interest in him. But you never know. Earlier today,
Yeah.
we had a rumor. We had a 3 hour span where Vucevic from the Bulls was looked at as an option, and everybody was panicking about it. And in 3 hours, he just signed back with the Bucks. With the Bucks, no, with the Bulls, and
Yep.
it wasn't Brawl anymore. So it's really hard to tell what is what. And even a guy that, as far as free agency goes with the Rockets, looked really well connected, like Jake Fisher, who reported the Vucevic news. Also, and prior to that, had reported Daniel Theis news earlier than everybody else. Now got it wrong about Vucevic, and so day before free agency, 24 hours, it's going to be a lot of rumors. We're going to get bombarded with news. A lot of it's going to be leveraged from agents and teams. And so we're just looking forward to having it all settled down. And those 10 to 15 minutes right after free agency opens, we'll probably get the answer that we're looking for.
See, and the leverage works both ways. Everyone always points out, and this is true, that agents of players across the league are going to be saying Houston's interested in my client because everybody knows the Rockets have all this cap space. They're incentivized to start winning now. We've talked about the pivot point so many times in the past, and it's very easy for an agent to point to Houston and try to drive up the bidding with the place that the player actually wants to go. And so Houston can be used. That's true. However, the flip side is that for people who are genuinely interested in going to Houston, there can be some angling for a bigger portion of that pie. So if you're trying to get conceivably Fred VanVleet, Brook Lopez, and Dylan Brooks and somehow make it all work, then it's absolutely possible that Brook Lopez and his reps could be leaking information about potentially going back to Milwaukee and a means of trying to get more money out of the Rockets. You're not really going to know until free agency actually opens. Now, when it opens, I think we'll find out really quickly. The theme I've heard consistently from the Rockets, and Kelly Eco reported this today as well, they are going to want to move quickly. They want to make it work within certainly days and perhaps hours, because if you don't get your top targets, you need to be able to move down your list relatively quickly before all the other options dry up, be it free agents, trades into your space. There's so many things you can do when you have that type of cap flexibility. And so once negotiations can officially start, I think the Rockets are going to present terms and say, look, you've got a couple hours to think about this. Tell us, are you in or are you out? And if they're out, they're going to go down the list. And so because of that, there could be some angling, especially in the days leading up to free agency. And we're recording this on Wednesday night, that some of the agents say, you know what, I'm not really sure, speaking on behalf of their client, if they want to go to a rebuilding situation in Houston, hoping that the Rockets cave at the last minute and offer a slightly bigger piece of that pie. And maybe they will. You laid out a quality argument for giving Lopez a bigger piece because there is a bit of a drop off between Brook and some of the other options. I've talked about Clint Capella, for example, as someone you could conceivably trade for if you didn't get Lopez, but there's a big hit with your spacing because obviously Brook Lopez is a good 3-point shooter. Clint Capella is not at all. So all of a sudden the spacing in those bench lineups with Amin Thompson could get pretty clunky. And that's a fair concern to point out. Absolutely. So that's the kind of thing, once you get to free agency on Friday night, the Rockets are going to be trying to get these agents basically to talk to their client and come to a resolution one way or the other very, very quickly. The Rockets are a team that's going to want to try and reach some of these deals within the first couple of hours, maybe within the first hour. We'll have to see. There could definitely be some fireworks when you have as much space as they do. As far as the general sense, I would say, of declining optimism in recent days, To me, this was always inevitable, unless you were going after a James Harden. And even James is fairly controversial within the fan base for reasons we've discussed in the past. By the way, I know it looks like the Rockets are out on James. Kelly Iko reported that. We'll circle back to that in a little bit. But I just think that in general, free agency always sounded better to most fans in an abstract sense. It's so easy to say, wow, we have $60 million in cap space. Imagine what you could do with that. But as we've discussed plenty of times in the past, the true peak guys don't actually make it to free agency. It's something that always sounds better in theory than it does in practice. The people that actually make it to the market are flawed in some way. And if you're a rebuilding team, there's also a bit of a tax that you typically have to pay to get players to sign with you. In the case of the Rockets, a team that went 22-60 last year, relative to where they were, especially when we've heard Ime Udoka talk about wanting to add winners. He said that at the press conference this week for the rookies, adding guys that have been there, done that, played in high-level situations, competed for championships. Okay, well, if you're trying to get somebody to leave a championship team for a squad in Houston that just went 22-60, you typically have to overpay a little bit. Now, I don't think it's going to be that detrimental to the Rockets because it's been reported numerous places, and I've heard the same, that they're focused on short-term deals, just basically for this season and next. That's what they're really focused on. And then in 2025, they can reassess. By that point, you might need to free up more minutes for your young guys. You would have early bird rights on them if you do want to retain them. But just in general, 2025 is a good point to reassess because that's also when your rookie extensions start to kick in for the guys you've drafted the last few years, most notably Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün, that 2021 class. So I think the Rockets are looking at this as a 2-year bridge to get them back to some level of relevancy. And for a lot of reasons, to get them to take a short-term deal, to get them to join a rebuilding situation, you're going to have to overpay. And the guys that are in the pool of free agents are not ideal. They're flawed in some way. You're not going to have a Giannis or Jokic just enter the market fresh off a championship in their late 20s. That's just not the way the NBA works these days. And yet I think it's just so easy when you hear these terms like $60 million in cap room for fans to just be over the moon thinking in the abstract until you get actually to the nitty gritty and you have to look at who the actual possibilities are. Then all of a sudden it gets a little hairier to the point where, again, I don't think anybody should be sad about it. You're still going to be improving your team, but it's not like anybody is just going to be over the moon about paying Fred VanVleet over $40 million per season. I get it. He's a good player. He's not a great player. It's not like he's going to radically transform you. Maybe he helps you make a bit of a play-in push next season. Certainly, it's not like you're going to be a playoff team. So again, I understand fans being a little underwhelmed, but the reality is that's the way free agency was always destined to be. And I do want to underscore, some have said, well, should the Rockets do this at all? Look, first off, they have to. You have to spend like 90% of the salary cap. That's the rule the NBA has in place. And so the Rockets have to spend $45 or $50 million no matter what just to get there. So there's going to have to be some spending just based on the collective bargaining agreement. But secondly, look, you've seen the last couple of years what can happen when there are literally no veterans in place, when there's no adult in the room other than, I suppose, Eric Gordon, and that was only half the time and he was traded at the deadline. There is value in getting guys that know what they're doing and to raise the baseline competency to where you don't have guys just mailing it in with their effort level the way the Rockets were entirely too early this past season. You could say the same about the season before that as well. There is absolutely value in getting you to a basic floor of competency heading into next season, especially because you're going to have guys like Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün entering year 3. And that's the point in which if they don't start taking the steps that you want them to take, it would be fair to have some concerns. So for a lot of reasons, the Rockets do need to spend this money. They don't need, I know it's sexy to say, just play the young guys because everybody's so excited about these guys that they've drafted. Look, this is basically, you can almost consider this free agency class, in my opinion, as part of the Harden trade. And what I mean by that is rather than take back guys like Karis LeVert, Jared Allen, Ben Simmons, the Rockets did something very unconventional when they kickstarted this rebuild in early 2021. They didn't do what the Pelicans did with Anthony Davis and they got back the package of draft picks and Brandon Ingram. They didn't do what last year, for example, the Jazz did with trading Donovan Mitchell. They got back Lauri Markkanen in the deal, didn't do what the Suns did at the deadline, or the Nets did trading with the Suns. And in the Kevin Durant deal that sent him to Phoenix, the Nets got Mikal Bridges back. They didn't do what Oklahoma City did in 2019 in the Paul George trade when they got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander back. Rafael Stone and the Rockets went almost entirely with draft equity. And I think part of it was they weren't over the moon about the players that were available at the time. I also think because of the limited window with the future pick obligations to Oklahoma City that kick in from the Russ CP trade starting next season, the Rockets said, hey, if it's even close, let's err on the side of just being super young, i.e. tanking and maximizing our draft haul. But the reality is, rather than take guys that would clog their books and perhaps demand extensions, like for example, Jared Allen got $20 million a year for 5 years from the Cavaliers once they took him instead of Houston in the Harden trade, the Rockets said, you know what, we'll be super young the next couple of years. We're totally bottom out. And rather than take any of these guys on our books, we'll just save up for 2023. That was always going to be the point in which they had room. First, it was the Russ contract, then it was the John Wall contract. 2023 was always the point in which they were set to have an enormous amount of flexibility. And rather than take any guys on that might help them be a bit more relevant in the short term, the Rockets said, you know what? And this is almost unheard of. They said, we're going to take a package for a true top 10 player, which Harden was at that time, that offers almost nothing in present value. Yeah, they got Victor Oladipo, but that was always a Hail Mary. That was always a, let's see if maybe you catch lightning in a bottle and he can somehow be the exception to the rule and coming back from that type of injury. In reality, they knew that it was a package focused almost entirely on draft equity. And an extension of that is that rather than put a player on their books that isn't perfect and might harm their draft odds a little bit in the short term, you know what? Let's just keep our books clean, and then we can bring in those types of players in 2023 once we have financial flexibility. So the way I would look at it, you should almost compare some of the guys that you can conceivably sign in this free agency class to guys like Caris LeVert, like Jared Allen, like Ben Simmons, that conceivably you could have landed in the Harden negotiations 2.5 years ago. Maybe Pascal Siakam, you can throw him in there as well. Michael Porter Jr., thinking back to all the various configurations of Harden trades we threw out there about 2 to 2.5 years ago. Because really, that's what this goes back to. The Rockets basically said, you know what? We'll do what very few teams do. We'll punt on the present. We'll just go all in on the future, and we'll circle back to the veterans in 2023. Well, now is the time. And I would say that while I don't think that the last 2 years have been devastating, look, you have seen some of the limitations of just throw the young kids and have no veterans, nobody that really knows what they're doing on the court. No, we've seen some of those habits affect the team and its development the last couple of years. And so this is the way that you can address that. So the way I would frame it for fans that are sort of underwhelmed by the names and the terms that are out there, consider this an offshoot of the Harden trade. Instead of getting guys like LeVert or Allen or Ben Simmons or whoever was out there conceivably 2.5 years ago, the Rockets said, you know what, we'll just pick this up in 2023. We'll maximize our draft capital in the interim. And now the Rockets are actually going to spend that money that might otherwise be tied up. And that's, people always ask, why are the Rockets at this stage in their rebuild spending that much money? When you look at teams like Oklahoma City and Utah that are similarly rebuilding, but aren't expected to be major free agency players? And the answer, again, it goes back to the trades. They got big salaries in the deals that they made for their superstars. Oklahoma City has Shai Gilgeous-Alexander on a big deal. Utah has Lauri Markkanen. They got Colin Sexton in that deal as well. The Rockets went almost entirely draft equity. Yeah, they had to wait a couple of years to have all the salaries roll off, but this was always their play. The Rockets just at a very high level, the Rockets built their foundation of their rebuild around a lot more flexibility than some of their rivals did. We can argue about whether that's the right strategy or the wrong strategy, but the reality is it's clear. It's been clear for 2 to 3 years. And now is the time that the Rockets are going to start bringing in, even if it's not an SGA type player, at least some capable veterans that can hopefully raise the floor of this young team. Because ultimately, that's why I think, for example, Oklahoma City's young players developed a lot last year. Sure, we can talk about coaching, but some of it's just you have SGA on the floor, you're going to be a lot more relevant. And that's, I think, what the Rockets are trying to do. It may not be as sexy as an SGA, but at a high level, you've got to spend this money. I guess, number one, you got to spend $45 million no matter what, just to reach the salary floor. But beyond that, to me, this is the Rockets' chance to do what they didn't do in the Harden trade, which is bring in the types of vets that raise the floor. And even if they're not the focal point, even if they're not the guys that 3-4 years from now are leading you on contending runs, again, we're talking about guys that can be a bridge. Basically, the Rockets just deferred getting that bridge for a couple of years, and now is the time to actually get those guys. That's the way I'm looking at it. Paulo, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And to compare it, I actually found a couple of comparisons I think are really interesting. If you look at the Pistons and what they did, they had, well, they were never really that good. They were transitioning out of the Blake Griffin era, but they had a high draft pick and they took Killian Hayes. And then the year after that, they had cap space and they went after Jeremy Grant and they paid him, a lot more than he was making with Denver. And they have faith that he was more than a role player. And it ended up paying off for them. And they had that kind of vet presence throughout the early point in the rebuild. As you said, the Rockets wanted to bottom out completely because they didn't have the time that the Pistons have, because the Pistons always owned all of the draft picks. So there was no clear time when the Pistons can be bad for as long as they want. If you look at the Jazz kept a lot of the vets that they got back, and they ended up getting the ninth pick in the draft out of it, as opposed to fully tanking and having a true shot at Victor Wembanyama, right? They made that decision. They currently have a lot of the vets, but they don't have the young talent that Houston has. It's a different situation. And then OKC is really hard because if you remember back at the Russell Westbrook and the Paul George trade, they were good for one extra year, and then they tanked all the way down. What's the difference? Well, as I said, all of these teams had their picks, or if they had traded them, they were protected enough that they could control their own fate. Rockets didn't. And you could make the argument that a couple of years later, the Thunder were truly in the depths of the rebuild. They did have cap space that they ended up using to take on Al Horford and doing, rebuilding team things. But at that time, it's different from what the Rockets have or had early on, because they didn't have that desperation to get vets in that can help you take that first jump that hopefully ignites the players that you already have into playing into, having an environment when they're playing better basketball, and that helps their development. That to them happened naturally because they had one player that was a lot further along than the rest of their young guys. They had Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who was easily 2 years, I think 3 years ahead of any of the guys that they drafted afterwards. Josh Giddey, all of those guys, 2 years ahead, because they got him on a rookie deal from the Paul George trade. And so he helped kickstart what the Rockets are trying to do, which is go from the terrible team to a mediocre team or a play-in type team. The Rockets don't have the luxury of Jalen Green being here. If Jalen Green were heading into his fourth year or into his fifth year, then perhaps it would make sense to take an approach similar to the Thunder. But it doesn't, because all of these guys are so young. And so what I would say is the most similar situation to what the Rockets are trying to do is actually the Atlanta Hawks heading into the 2020-2021 season. They had Trae Young on a rookie contract. They had DeAndre Hunter. They had Onyeka Okongwu still. They had John Collins still on his rookie deal. Kevin Huerter. A lot of good young players. They had just traded for Clint Capella in a deal with the Rockets, and they had cap space. And if you recall back to this free agency year, this was after AD was traded to the Lakers. He had 1 year on his contract, but they couldn't extend him for the max, and so he had to hit free agency to then resign with the Lakers. And he was the only major free agent out there. Other than that, it was the Jeremy Grants of the world. And what did Atlanta do? They had a cap space, they had a really young team, and they went out and got some vets to help kickstart what was a 20-win team into a 30-win team or a 35-win team. And back then, those vets were Danilo Gallinari and Bogdan Bogdanovic. And if you go and look at the structures of their contracts, although they were 4-year contracts and although they were getting paid roughly $20 million a year, or 18 and 19 million a year, which if you scale up to today's cap space would be 22 to 23 million a year. The structures of those contracts included team options and non-guaranteed years at the end of them, which made them basically 2 or 3 year deals, which is what the Rockets are targeting. And so what the Rockets are trying to do is exactly the same. Bring in vets that fit into any play style that you're trying to play. If you look at Bogdan Bogdanovic, who was a restricted free agent, if you guys remember, there was some drama with the Bucks going after him, and then the tampering fine, they had to back off.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the types of role players that they are, Danilo Gallinari is going to fit into any team. He's an elite shooter, stretch four. He's going to fit into any team that you're trying to build. Bogdan Bogdanovic, the same thing. He's a sharpshooting two guard that has, some ability to put the ball on the floor, but he's kind of a microwave scorer that's also an elite shooter, so he can play off ball really well. And so what the Rockets are trying to do is bring in guys, there is no max free agent, just like there wasn't for the Hawks. They have young players in place, perhaps more than the Hawks had, but that can only be a good thing. And now you're going to bring in players that are going to fit into whatever play style you want to play. They're going to perhaps bring something to the team that you may lack for the Rockets, that's defense and shooting, and actually playmaking, because they do need a point guard, because I don't think Amen Thompson's ready right away. But it's the same philosophy. You're going to bring in mid-tier, high-end role players, which are mid-tier free agents, the 20 million a year to 25 million a year type of guys. And you're going to overpay them in order to get them to take shorter deals. So you're not committed to them long term, because you never know what each of our young players are going to turn into and how quickly they'll be able to take over, which is what the Hawks did. And you're going to play both ends of it. You're going to, if they're good enough, or if the young players are good enough, they will be able to take over. If not, you have the vets to be able to still uphold a certain standard on the team. The team will still be able to win games, and it will be a competitive environment that will, encourage players to play their best and not care just about stats, and not go into a game expecting to lose every time, which is what has happened the last couple of years. I think Rafael Stone made a kind of to put in perspective how important it is to actually play competitive games, because there are people out there that think that Rockets they can't get their guys at a low cost or at a fair contract and make them asset that should just take on salary dumps. Rafael Stone made a good case as to why that isn't really the case, which is, he mentioned how sometimes young players, it's not that they, and this was on an interview with Sports Talk 790, I'm fairly certain, how at times it's not that players know how to play winning basketball and choose not to, which is the case with some vets. It's that young players don't know how to play winning basketball, and so they revert back to what made them win games in their way to the NBA. If you look at a guy like Jalen Green, when he was playing in high school and he was the king of the world, he would try to follow whatever the coach was trying to do, and when it didn't work because his teammates weren't good enough, or for whatever the reason it was, the solution was, I'm going to take the ball myself, I'm going to bring it up the court, and I'm going to shoot it every single time, and I'm so much better than these other guys that this is going to work. And this is the default mindset that's there because of how AAU ball works, and because it's just, okay, if I can't win a certain way, I'm going to take it upon myself to win. And when a bunch of players do this, it leads to and you add that to the lack of accountability, to the lack of competitiveness at their position, with the lack of good coaching. It leads to the problem that multiple rebuilding teams do. And to move on from this mindset is why it's important. It is the entire reason it's important to bring in vets, because this might be the default behavior for Jalen Green, who was a scoring guard. There may be different like ways of getting to the same conclusion for different types of archetypes of players. Perhaps one of the reasons why Şengün was so effective and so kind of looked more mature on the court is the fact that throughout his entire career, he probably wasn't this phenom playing AAU ball. He was probably playing in a league setting, in a youth league somewhere in Turkey, where he wasn't just this clear phenom, better than everybody else, I'm going to take it all upon myself, because that's not really the culture in sports in Europe, especially basketball. And so, because of all of these things, is why it's important. It's why they have to bring in vets to kind of take that extra step and look like a competent team. Now, it's up to the Rockets to make sure that the vets that they do bring in are flexible, can fit well with the guys that we currently have. The money is not really the problem. It's more how they will impact the team on the court, because as I said before, it's a zero-sum game. They are going to have to spend the money. It's just how they decide to spread the money across different free agents. And ideally, you want to spend a lot of money on a few free agents rather than little money on a bunch of them, because you have so many young players and there's only so many roster spots. There are actually a lot of factors that that contribute to what the Rockets are willing to do to get a guy like Fred VanVleet, right? Or a guy like Brook Lopez, who even at $22 million a year is probably an overpay and more than he would get from the Bucks. So the fact that it's a zero-sum game, it's the fact that they have to spend the money, and it's the fact that even within the money they have to spend, they would rather sign a couple of top guys or three, high-tier guys rather than, and perhaps they'll be on bloated salaries and they won't be assets, because that's not the point. The point is to get the product on the floor to be better. That's the main goal. The main goal isn't to take these guys and flip them down the line. No, that's why you're giving them small contracts. It's because it's about what they can contribute right now over the next couple of years to make this team play competitive basketball. And considering how many young guys we have, they have to play, and how many rotation spots are available, you would rather spend $40 million a year on Fred VanVleet and $20 million on Brook Lopez, and know that those are not going to be value deals for 2 years, than you would to go and get, I don't know, I could pull up the free agency list right now, but go get a Kyle Kuzma at $20 million a year plus, no, that's $20 million a year. It's still kind of a mid-tier free agent, but just looking at the list right now, then go and get a Jordan Clarkson at $12 million a year plus a Dwight Powell at $9 million a year plus a Mason Plumlee at $9 million a year plus a Seth Curry at $8 million a year. You could bring in 6 or 7 guys at value deals if you wanted to. But that's not the goal, because they're going to come here and aren't really going to play, and they're going to get in the way of the young guys. So that's why the Rockets are in a really unique situation. And sometimes when I talk to fans of other teams, they don't really understand. They look at $80 million for Fred VanVleet for 2 years, and they wonder, well, why would you not rather have like a normal team? Why would you rather not pay $120 million but for 4 years? And so instead of paying 40, you're paying $30 million per year. All of these nuances are kind of hard to explain, but it's the truth of the unique positions the Rockets find themselves in that I've explained so far.
Yeah, and again, this circles back to the Harden trade, because the real pivot point for the franchise is actually going to come about 2025, 2026, when you hope that at least one or two of these young studs, or what you hope to be young studs that you've drafted in this period, are capable of actually developing by the time they're in year 4, year 5, year 6 into something close to being the best or second best player on a championship level team. And by that point, even if they can't do it themselves, and maybe you're close enough to where it makes sense to cash in all of your assets, talk about all the future Brooklyn picks, the fact that after 2026, the Rockets have all of their own, then maybe you can be a splash destination for a leverage trade that you can combine with your young guys that are at that point reaching something closer to the prime of their NBA careers. That's the actual pivot point. This is simply the pivot point financially. And so it makes sense for them at this point to start filling out the roster the way they didn't over the last couple of years. But in a way, you still are, Rafael Stone has called it phase 2, but it's almost like phase 1B. You're still in phase 1. Now you're going to be doing something more analogous to what, again, teams like Oklahoma City and Utah did a year ago, where you have these developing prospects and you're combining them with other veterans that can help them in their development. The actual pivot point, at least from a big picture franchise, when are they ready to take deep playoff runs and beyond, is still probably a couple of years away. And again, that's why the Rockets are looking at these 2-year deals, because that allows them to reassess at that time. You also have early bird rights if you want to keep them. I do want to address very quickly, I've seen some say, well, what if you just sign a bunch of 1-year deals? Look, if you do that, how are you going to be in a materially better place a year from now to spend the money? And a year from now is the last time that you can actually do it, because in 2025, you're going to have those rookie extensions start kicking in for Jalen and Alperen Şengün. So it's either this year or next. And the type of guys you could get for 1-year deals, they're not going to be good enough to do much for you in terms of wins and losses this season. And then you're right back in the same place a year from now, and perhaps you're even less desirable, because it's not like you have the new coach factor to sort of say, look, this is new. This is not going to be the Steven Silas era. No, if you just do these 1-year deals, then you're probably back in the same exact place a year from now. And then at that point, you're even more leveraged, because everybody knows you have no choice but to spend it, because starting in 2025, it's almost certainly going to be gone unless your young guys just all bust. And at that point, you have an entirely different problem. But I think the reality is that it makes sense for the Rockets, even if you have to overpay, to spend that money now, and it's going to make them a better team. And I just think, again, there's just a bit of a fundamental misunderstanding by a lot of fans as to what free agency actually is
Yeah,
in the
and
NBA.
to be fair, we are in a very atypical situation compared to most to most cap space teams that are heading into free agency. So I kind of understand why the concept and all of the nuance is pretty new, because we are very restricted in what we're looking for, and that leads to and I think it's actually a good sign from the front office that they are thinking differently than what a typical team would think, because they are in a very different situation, and that shows an ability to adapt. And even if I don't like the targets in specific, they still make sense, which is why I say, hey, I'm not the biggest fan of Dylan Brooks, and I'm not the biggest fan of Fred VanVleet, but for the situation that they're in and the type of contracts that they're handing out, those guys it makes sense to go after those guys, because they fill a need on a team. They're going to help right away. They're guys that bring culture, all of the guys that they're tied to. They're guys that fit into what the team's trying to do. And they're guys that have an incentive to take on, or that either don't have competing offers for more years, or have an incentive to go on shorter deals. For Fred VanVleet, he's going to be 30 if he takes a 2-year deal. He's going to be 31 by the end of it. It will be his last big contract if he plays well, and it'll be right at the 2025 new TV deal that the NBA is negotiating. For Dylan Brooks, he's just coming off from a public perception standpoint, a terrible season where he challenged LeBron and then wasn't good enough to own up to it and on the court, back it up. But he's still 27. He's still going to be 29 by the time his deal's over, and he'll, get a second chance to go into free agency again and try and get the most money that he can. With Brook Lopez, for a different reason, nobody's going to offer him more than 2 years because he is 35 years old. And so for him, it also makes sense to take a shorter deal. And so basically, all this to say that I think it's actually a good thing that the front office recognizes this very special place they're in, and they're not approaching it this like what the typical way is to approach cap space, which is to get value deals that could turn into assets long term, because it's really not what the team needs, not really what makes sense for the situation. And their ability to adapt actually makes me more comfortable with their ability to build this team going forward.
Yeah. And I should mention, by the way, in the 1-year scenario that I've seen tossed out, you would also be wasting yet another year of development for your young guys, because you wouldn't be surrounding them with the optimal type of vets. So that might be the biggest consequence of all. In reality, they're going to have to spend this money. And I want to talk briefly about James Harden, because there is some news from Kelly Iko of The Athletic that the Rockets are effectively out of the running for Harden as he understands it. And that more or less jives with the stuff I've heard for weeks now. I do think, looking back to all the Harden pods that we've done in the past, this is why I've never understood the outrage that some had. And again, I think a lot of it's just emotional over the way he left, and people get in their feels when he doesn't come through in the playoffs, which shouldn't be a consideration here at all for reasons we've discussed in the past. But yeah, I just never understood the outrage, because it's like, look, when you get down to the nitty gritty, what do you think you're actually going to be doing with this money? It's not like there's going to be something that's just clearly a huge win to where you're wanting to have a parade outside Toyota Center. No, free agency typically does not work that way in the NBA. Everything is leverage trades with the true star level players, and those rarely want to go to a destination like Houston. It was always going to be this way if it wasn't James Harden, and ultimately that's the path that the Rockets chose. And I'm not in love with it, but I do think it will help, and I think it should get these young guys in a better position to develop in ways that they haven't the last couple of years. Look, the one thing I'll say on Harden to close the loop, I think what changed from the Rockets' perspective, well, number one, I think the majority of the stories that have been leaked since Christmas were from James Harden's people and not the Rockets. Now, I don't think the Rockets were necessarily against it. That's why you didn't hear a lot of pushback. But I think the root element was from Harden's camp. And I don't think it was leverage. No, I feel very confident in saying he had and still has, if the interest was there, a legitimate interest in returning to Houston for reasons that go beyond basketball. It's his home on a number of levels. However, I think from a Rockets perspective, what they needed to do after that season ended was certainly get a coach, but also decide how they wanted to play. They couldn't make any long-term decisions, talking philosophically, until they brought the new coach and his staff in place and could sit down and have hard meetings, which in the press conference the other day, Rafael Stone talked about, the gloves coming off and some of the discussions with Udoka and how he views the roster and what they need to do. The honeymoon phase is over. Now you can actually talk about how you mold these guys and this team moving forward. Look, there were things the Rockets just simply could not give a real answer to until they knew who their coach was and what style they wanted to play. And so I think for the months of leaks that came from Harden's camp, sure, the Rockets were potentially interested. They knew that they were going to be looking to sign guys to short-term deals. James Harden turning 34 could be a candidate for that because of his age. And there's absolutely certain circumstances. He's still a top 20 type player when he's healthy, led the league in assists last year. Clearly the Rockets need a point guard where he could have helped. But at the end of the day, the Rockets, it wasn't so much that they'd say, no, we're not interested in Harden, because there were absolutely scenarios where they could have been. But they couldn't say they conclusively would be interested either, because they didn't even know who their coach was and how he'd want to play. So from the Rockets standpoint, there was just a lot of sort of, yeah, we could be, but let's just see how this plays out, and we'll pick up the discussions in the summer. And they picked up these discussions since hiring Ime Udoka. And the bottom line is Ime has a lot of say over personnel. You probably noticed at the press conference when I asked for Feld a question about rookies, most notably Amin Thompson and Cam Whitmore, perhaps playing less this year than Jalen and Jabari did the last two because of transitioning to phase 2 of the rebuild. Rafael quickly redirected me to Ime, pointing out that Ime has that control. And certainly he does over game-to-game management in terms of minutes, but I think also he has a voice in personnel. He had options around the NBA. Coaches like that, they have a lot of leverage and they use it, and they pick a destination that gives them a little bit of control. And I'm sure you noticed, Paolo, that Ime was in the war room with Rafael Stone on draft night, making those phone calls. He's a part of the process. And I just think that the way it's been phrased to me, Harden would have been great for the development of Jabari Smith Jr. and Tari Eason, but they were much more uncertain about the guys who need the ball in their hands, if that would be workable for them. And ultimately, since the Rockets aren't going to win a championship no matter what in the next year or two, then that's the bigger long-term goal. It's how do you develop the non-Jabari and Tari guys? Because I think Jabari and Tari are so plug and play. Yeah, they would have been great with Harden. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Jabari was the guy that went out of his way during the last couple of months to actually make a case for bringing Harden here. It's the others. It's Jalen Green. It's Alperen Sengun. It's Kevin Porter Jr. It's Amin Thompson now that you've drafted him. These are guys that need the ball in their hands more to truly unlock their value. And James Harden, even though he's a great passer, look, he is ball dominant. That's his playing style. Even though I think it was exaggerated, the Chris Haynes basketball freedom quote does tie into this a little bit. There were concerns that Harden in the short term would not have been best for the development of those types of players in the long term, as opposed to someone like Fred VanVleet, who can provide a little bit more off-ball value, isn't as ball dominant, can be a bit more aggressive defensively. There's just a lot more ways you can fit in a Fred VanVleet around the young guys that you're trying to develop and hopefully turn into high usage guys on championship contenders a few years from now, that being your Jalen, Amin, Sengun class. It would have been very difficult to blend them with Harden. And I think, if the Rockets were just purely trying to win in the next couple of years, they would have said, yeah, let's just take the wins and we'll worry about the rest later. But at the end of the day, it's not about that. It's about, certainly you want a few more wins, but you also want to make sure that you understand the bigger picture, which is development and trying to get these young guys to the level at which they actually can carry a championship team or something close to that a few years down the line. And ultimately, they think that a guy like Fred VanVleet is an easier fit. Bottom line, will it work? Time will tell. There's arguments both ways, but the reality is, look, when you hire Ime Udoka, a coach of that stature, he deserves the right to make that call. I think even more than the draft, getting the coaching hire right was probably the most important thing they could do this whole offseason. I think they did. And once he came in, I think there's a certain way that he wants to build out this roster. And I just don't think that James Harden is a fit for it. And as someone that was open to the Harden return scenario, I may not entirely love it. There may be times next season, if Harden has a great game, that I say, wow, why couldn't the Rockets have added him, especially if Fred VanVleet is shooting sub 40% from the field again? Not saying it's going to work 100%, but I will say that if you invest heavily in a coach like Ime Udoka and you give him the autonomy that luring a coach of that stature requires, you've got to let him make tough decisions. And I just think the bottom line is it's pretty clear that the Van Fleet model is what Ime Udoka sees as the right short-term bridge for guys like Jalen and All-P and Amin Thompson, and time will tell as to whether he's right, but ultimately he's earned the right to make that choice. And from a general manager perspective, in terms of Rafael Stone, I think playing to Ime's vision and giving him a chance to implement that vision, that's got to be the first priority. And so ultimately, if Ime has a lot of conviction about this being the path, then Rafael should follow it, right? Especially if the contracts are fairly short term, and it's not like you're talking about, whether it's Harden, whether it's Van Fleet, whether it's somebody else entirely. It's not like any of these guys is going to be around in all likelihood by the time you're trying to contend. So since we're simply talking about a short-term bridge, no matter what, I mean, you may as well say, you know what, Ime, I'll trust you, and let's see how this works out, right?
Yeah, and to me, I think if they were given the chance to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if they were given the chance to sign James Harden on a 2-year, $84 million contract, I think that they would instead of Van Vliet. But I think it
I
also
actually
plays.
don't.
You don't think?
No.
Damn. I don't know if I agree with that or not. I can see the point for wanting a better defensive off-ball point guard when it needs to be. But I also think that ultimately there has to be a portion of it that is, hey, Harden's not going to settle for the same terms that Fred VanVleet will. And if there's a big emphasis on this being a bridge, it's not only do I think Philly's more desperate than Houston to give Harden more money, more long term, and therefore, have an advantage in keeping him. I also think it's a lot harder to, if you bring Harden in and someone's ready earlier on, if Jalen Green takes a leap, if Amen Thompson takes a leap, Alperen Şengün takes a leap, it would be a lot harder to transition from Harden into one of those guys because Harden is a much, as you said, a ball handler, has more, how the hell do I say this? Has more of a, not a reputation, but has more of a track record. And it will always be harder to diminish Harden's role than it would be to diminish a guy like Fred VanVleet, just because of the players that they are and the reputation, the kind of the histories that they have. As far as being successful, Harden is an all-star and was for most of his career. It's harder to scale back down a guy like that. But ultimately, even if you say that given the same contract they would go with Fred VanVleet, I can also understand why. Because, as you said, I think people sometimes think that we are bringing in the vets to win, right? But we are not bringing in the vets to win by themselves, and it's a lot of, we're bringing in vets to enhance and into kind of make the game easier for the core pieces that are already in place. Because when you look at the team, yes, we're bringing in vets and that's the priority, and they're going to have a meritocracy type of deal going on. At the same time, they do understand that Jalen Green, Amen Thompson, Jabari Smith, Alperen Şengün, these are the guys that are going to increase the ceiling of your team. And so they are the priority. And I think it's a lot harder to convince Harden that they are the priority and that he's not the most important player on the team than it is to tell Fred VanVleet, hey, you're coming in, right? And you are probably the best player on the team at the time that you come in. But your game suits all of these players a lot better. And if need be, and if Jalen Green takes a leap and is now an all-star level player, Fred VanVleet will have a much easier time deferring to him than a guy like James Harden would, just because of the type of games that they have. And so, even though I'm not the biggest fan of Fred VanVleet, I can see how his skill set, kind of like a Marcus Smart to some extent on higher volume, can at least on offense, can fit better with what they're trying to do. Because as I said, at the end of the day, they're bringing in vets to make the team more competitive and to increase wins, but they're not bringing in the vets to win for the young players. No, they're bringing in the vets to help the young players win by putting some more solid experience pieces around them. And it's not we're trying to maximize. If they had a chance, I don't think they would bring in a full starting five of vets that are going to get them 35 wins versus bringing in the vets that fit better around the young players that would only get you 30 wins, but those wins would come from young players breaking through and with the help of the vets getting to those 30 wins. Because at the end of the day, if the goal were to have the vets carry the young players for the entire season, they wouldn't have gone through a rebuild. They would have, stayed mediocre, taken Ben Simmons, taken Karis LeVert, and kept going that way.
Yeah. Look, the bottom line, I'll say, the conversations that I've had, terms never really entered into it. They knew of his interest in returning, and I think especially at his age, there was something reasonable that could have been worked out, particularly given his desire to be here, which I don't believe that was leverage at all. I've heard that from multiple sides of the equation. They had the opportunity. I just think it simply comes down to playing style. That's what I heard over and over again the last few weeks. During the season, it was more, again, just vague. Yeah, we could be interested, but it was more, again, just to wait and see. Who are they going to hire as head coach? How do they want to play? But I think, particularly after hiring Ime Udoka, there's just been consistent messaging that they want a certain type of player to mold with these young guys. And ultimately, Fred VanVleet is, James Harden isn't. And I think that applies even if the money was hypothetically the same. And you may not agree with that if you're listening. I just think, that's their thought process. And if you're going to spend big money to get a coach like Ime Udoka, who's being paid top 10, almost top 5 in the NBA, and you compete against other teams to get him, you give him a lot of power, you'd be doing a disservice if you didn't let him try to implement his vision. And at least when we're talking about short-term bridge pieces, if you're Rafael Stone, even if you think that James Harden might be the better player in a vacuum, which I don't think there's any might to it, he is. Look, you do need to be deferential, especially in this point now where the Rockets are still trying to build the culture. They're trying to set the tone. It's not just about wins. It's also about getting these guys to a level that they haven't reached before, breaking the bad habits. And if Ime Udoka thinks this is the best way to do it, then I'm willing to be open-minded to that. And again, let's see how this plays out. Last topic before we close out. I do think that aside from free agency signings or trades, we've talked a little bit about potential targets. If you want more on that, you can go back in our Logger Line archives a couple of weeks and look at our free agency preview episode. We've got plenty of names on that one that the Rockets could pursue, both in terms of free agents as well as trade targets with their cap room. This is more just about our expectations of what's actually going to happen once free agency opens on Friday night. Aside from anyone they might sign or trade for, I think there's also going to be some situations internally that they have to handle, particularly with fringe players on the roster. Don't want to spend too much time talking about the Usman Garuba and Josh Christophers of the world. I think they would offload them for a decent second-round pick if they could, just simply because of the roster logjam, all the young players, and then you're signing these veterans as we were talking about. But I do think you're going to have to trade one of KJ Martin or Jae'Sean Tate. The bottom line is KJ's got a decision on his option that has to be made Thursday. Either you bring him back on his current deal and he'll be unrestricted a year from now in 2024 free agency, or you do as you did with Jae'Sean Tate a year ago, you turn it down, make him restricted this summer, and perhaps leverage him into a deal between the restricted status and giving him a payday a year earlier into friendlier terms over the long haul. Really, at this point, I think it's less about the terms and it's more about just which one the Rockets see more as in their long-term future. Because the reality is, look, Jae'Sean Tate is on a friendly deal. Even if you keep KJ Martin, reality is you're going to have to give him a deal at least at Tate's level, if not more than that, by a year from now at the latest. So either way, you're going to have a guy in that salary slot that can play the 3 or the 4. And yet you already have Jabari Smith Jr. and Tari Eason at those positions. You just drafted Cam Whitmore. You're going to sign someone, probably Dylan Brooks, to give you more of a defensive wing presence in free agency. And who knows? We saw one report from that Kings blogger that Kyle Kuzma could still be in play for the Rockets. The bottom line is the forward spots are going to be occupied in a hurry. And so with those guys being more marginal types, I don't know which it's going to be, although there does seem to be more traction around the KJ trade, just reading the tea leaves. That's what Jake Fisher reported today. But I think that by the end of this weekend at the latest, and maybe you do need to trade Jae'Sean Tate, a slight factor is that you could open up a bit more cap room this summer if you're in a pinch by dealing Tate. But even if they don't need the cap room for reasons that go beyond just how much money you spend in 2023 free agency, I think one of those guys gets traded the next few days to resolve that logjam. I think aside from everything they do with free agency and trades, that's something that in terms of just internal roster management, I would be very surprised if we're talking a week from now and both of those guys, KJ Martin and Jae'Sean Tate, are on the roster, right?
Yeah, I actually think that both of them are gone, no matter what.
Yeah, they both could be. Yeah.
I don't think it's a choice at this point. I think You're
Just
bringing
asset
in,
management.
yeah, if not Dylan Brooks, you're going to bring in someone that plays the same position. I don't think Dylan Brooks is going to play shooting guard here like he did in Memphis, purely because there's Jalen Green and there's Kevin Porter Jr. and there's Amen Thompson, and there's whatever point guard that you're going to bring in. The 1 and the 2 are filled. You're not going to run more than a 9 or a 10 man rotation, which means you're going to let's look at it in an optimistic way. Let's say it's 10 man rotation. You have two small forwards and two power forwards. Jabari Smith's going to play, Tyrese going to play, whoever they bring in, call it Dylan Brooks, is going to play. And so for the last spot, I would bet that there's no last spot. That there's going to be a 9 man rotation, and it's going just to be Alperen Sengun and whatever center they bring in. But then even if there is, I would be pretty confident in saying that Cam Whitmore, and this may be a hot take, but Cam Whitmore year 1 will be, if not just as good or better, close enough to what KJ Martin brings you to warrant that playing time. Just because he's just as instinctual of a cutter as KJ Martin is, just as athletic, he's a better shooter, and most important of all, if we're judging KJ Martin by what he did last season, he's the better defender as well. And so, taking all of that into consideration, I think both Tate and KJ are going to just be gone, unless either of them is happy not having a rotational spot for most of the season, unless injuries happen. Which leads me to the actual focal point, which is what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. The decision about KJ Martin, whether to pick up his option or not. I don't know if you've heard anything concrete, but if I were making the choice, my conversation with KJ would be just this: hey, what are you looking for in an extension? And I would see, and so if it's under 10 million and you're okay with not being guaranteed minutes next season, and you just come in you get your money, right? We'll pay you your money, but you just come in case there's an injury, or in case someone's playing so poorly that you just can't keep them on the rotation anymore. We hope that's not the case. If he's okay with those terms, I would extend him. I would make him a free agent and extend him. If not, I think in 95% of scenarios, you take the team option and you trade them, because taking the team option makes it so you can trade them right away. If not, if you extend them, you're going to have to wait 6 months to trade them.
Yeah.
And not only that, you're going to have to trade him at his new salary versus his current salary, which is just 1.9 million, which makes a difference, because I think right now, not only is he young and has some appeal to a younger team, the fact that he's only making 1.9 million a year and he's already a capable rotational piece for a good team, if he were placed in one, makes it so the fact that he's only making that little money is really valuable. It's really valuable from a team planning standpoint if he's traded during free agency, because a contender may trade their current backup mid-level exception level, which is 10 million a year level power forward or small forward, and say, hey, we'll reallocate these resources to go get a guard or a big, but we'll trade for KJ Martin. And since he's making so little money, the offset, which is about 8 million, we can spend on a point guard or a big or a shooting guard, whatever. And so that it makes sense from that perspective. And also, if you pick up his option and you take him into the season, then when rosters are already built, whatever team is trading for them only needs to give up a minimum guy to trade for them, which means you can convert his value into draft picks a lot more easily, because the other team doesn't have to be worrying about, if he's making 10 million a year, the other team has to, into the calculus goes the draft asset that the Rockets want, plus what I'm losing by giving up a player that's making 10 million, and that's going to limit your market a lot. And so for me, it's 95% of scenarios you should pick up KJ's option and look to trade him. If he's okay not playing, which I highly doubt that he is, but maybe he only wants to play to get his extension, and if he gets his extension, he's fine. If that's the case, and he wants his extension to be under or around or under $10 million a year, then at that point I would make him a restricted free agent, and as they did with Jae'Sean Tate, get a friendlier deal out of it, because as long as he doesn't make too much noise in the locker room because he's not playing.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think you pick up the option and trade him. That's the highly likely scenario. And then, you have enough depth at the forward spots, especially with who you're likely to sign, that if you're in a position that you need more salary cap room, then Tate's a guy who I don't think is particularly essential long-term to the puzzle. You could easily trade both of them, and I don't think Ime Udoka would be in a pinch at all when it comes to filling out his rotation the next couple of years. So my guess is that KJ is very likely to move for the reasons that you just outlined. He should be a decent asset on the market. And beyond that, Tate's definitely a candidate as well. And some of that, of course, is going to depend on exactly who says yes and how much money they need this weekend once free agency opens. Anyway, with that, we'll put a bow on this episode. For Paulo, I'm Ben. If you want more content before our next show, the best place to get it is on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben DuBose. Paulo is on there at Paulo Alves NBA. And of course, we'll have reaction shows once news leaks this weekend and early next week in free agency, just as we did after the draft. But of course, it'll take us a little bit of time to set those up, edit the episodes, all that good stuff. So if you want real-time info, the best place to get it, of course, is on social media. And so Twitter is obviously the place to go. If you want content beyond that, of course, Rockets Wire, where I'm the editor, check out rocketswire.usatoday.com, or the easier way, just go to the Logger line on Twitter and hit up that link tree in our bio, because that's got the links to certainly Rockets Wire, also Sports Talk 790, friend of this program, official flagship radio station of the team, Carbach Brewing, which supports this show, sponsored by Clutch City Lager. You can find all of their content simply through the link tree on our Twitter page. You can also find your individual distributors there, Apple, Google, Spotify, so on and so forth. Just, again, go to that link tree and you can find all the resources you need to find out more information about this show or to support some of our many friends, sponsors, and partners. With the plugs complete, I'll wrap up. For Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always to you guys for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line. Happy free agency.